The White House is often called the most powerful home on earth, a symbol of democracy, leadership, and national pride. But behind the white walls and polished columns lies a cost few Americans ever see. This building was not just paid for with money, it was paid for with lives, political sacrifice, hidden deals, and generations of public trust. Every renovation, every expansion, every moment of power inside these walls came with a price, one the nation continues to pay long after the headlines fade. Tonight, we uncover what the White House truly cost America, and why the price of power is never as clean as it looks. From the outside, the building appears calm, permanent, and reassuring. White walls, balanced columns, a symbol designed to project stability and authority. It is presented as the house of the people, a place where democracy lives and decisions are made for the common good. But behind this carefully maintained image lies a much heavier story, one measured not only in dollars, but in consequences, compromises, and invisible costs carried by the nation for more than 2 centuries. The creation of this seat of power was never simple or neutral. From the very beginning, its construction reflected the contradictions at the heart of the country itself. Built to represent liberty, it relied on labor drawn from inequality. Enslaved workers quarried stone, cut timber, and laid foundations, their lives absorbed into a structure that would later stand as a symbol of freedom. That contradiction was not an accident of history, it was an early signal of the true price behind power. As the building grew, so did the financial burden attached to it. Construction costs exceeded early estimates, repairs followed fires and wars, and renovations became constant. Each generation added layers not only of architecture but of expense. The public rarely saw the bills, but taxpayers carried them. Over time, maintaining the image of permanence required constant investment, reinforcing the idea that power must always appear stable, no matter the cost beneath it. Yet the price paid was never only financial. The building shaped how power itself functioned. Decisions made within its walls affected millions, often without transparency. War strategies, economic policies, surveillance programs, and executive actions flowed outward from rooms closed to public view. The structure became more than a residence or office. It became a filter through which national priorities were decided by a small number of individuals, concentrating influence in ways that reshaped democracy itself. Security transformed the building further. Each crisis added new layers of protection, fencing, surveillance, and restricted access. What was once designed to feel approachable slowly became fortified. This physical separation mirrored a growing distance between leadership and ordinary citizens. The building stood at the center of the nation, yet felt increasingly unreachable, reinforcing a quiet message about who power was really for. The cost of this concentration extended into foreign policy. From this address, wars were authorized, alliances forged, and interventions justified. Decisions made far from battlefields carried consequences paid by soldiers, civilians, and future generations. The building became associated not just with leadership, but with the machinery of global influence. Power exercised here shaped the world, often at immense human cost, rarely felt by those who signed the orders. Domestically, the structure influenced how authority was perceived. Its symbolism elevated the executive role beyond administration into spectacle. Personalities became brands, decisions became narratives. Power was framed as singular, embodied in one office, one voice, one address. This perception shifted public expectations, encouraging reliance on individuals rather than institutions, and placing enormous influence in a space never designed to carry such weight alone. Over time, the building absorbed the nation's anxieties. Economic collapse, social unrest, scandal, and protest all pressed against its gates. Each crisis demanded a response from within, reinforcing the idea that solutions flowed from this single location. This expectation came with its own cost, the narrowing of civic imagination. As attention focused inward, other forms of collective problem-solving weakened. The cultural price was equally profound. The building became a backdrop for ceremonies, announcements, and carefully staged moments meant to reassure the public. These performances reinforced trust, but also blurred the line between reality and image. What was shown was calm and controlled. What remained hidden were debates, compromises, and pressures shaping outcomes behind closed doors. Power learned to manage perception as carefully as policy. Maintenance of this image required continuous adaptation. Technology reshaped the building's operations, expanding communication, surveillance, and control. What began as a residence evolved into a command center. Decisions accelerated, consequences multiplied. The pace of power increased, while public oversight struggled to keep up. Each advancement promised efficiency, but often deepened the gap between authority and accountability. The building also shaped leadership itself. Those who occupied it found their roles transformed by its symbolism. The weight of history pressed in from every direction. Past decisions lingered in the rooms, creating expectations, habits, and institutional momentum. Even leaders who entered promising change often left shaped by the structure more than they shaped it. Power, once inside, proved difficult to escape or reform. Financially, the costs continued to accumulate quietly. Renovations, security upgrades, staffing, and operations required constant funding. These expenses were justified as necessary for national stability, rarely questioned in detail. Over time, they normalized the idea that preserving the appearance of power justified almost any cost. The building's needs became inseparable from the nation's budget, embedding privilege into public finance. The social cost appeared in trust. As decisions made within the building increasingly felt distant from everyday life, skepticism grew. Citizens saw policies announced but not always explained, promises made but not always fulfilled. The structure stood firm, but confidence wavered. The building remained, while belief in the system it represented fluctuated. Despite this, the symbol endured. The building continued to be presented as timeless, neutral, and necessary. Its image softened its impact. The costs it imposed were spread across generations, diluted by tradition and ceremony. Each era inherited not only the structure, but the accumulated consequences of decisions made within it. What emerges from this history is not a story of a single building, but of how power organizes itself. The structure did not merely house authority, it shaped how authority functioned, justified itself, and protected its position. The price paid was ongoing, complex, and often invisible, measured not only in money, but in trust, transparency, and shared responsibility. The true cost of this seat of power lies in what it normalized. Distance between decision and consequence, symbolism over substance, and permanence over accountability. Its walls absorbed contradictions, conflicts, and compromises, standing firm as the nation changed around it. In doing so, it became both a stabilizing force and a silent weight, shaping the course of the country in ways rarely examined, but always felt. From the moment it was conceived, the building was meant to represent unity, authority, and permanence. It was designed to embody the ideals of a young republic, projecting confidence to both citizens and foreign powers. Yet behind this carefully constructed image lies a cost that was never fully acknowledged at the time, and has rarely been confronted since. The price of power was not paid only in stone, timber, and labor, but in contradictions that would echo through generations. The earliest cost was human. Much of the physical labor required to build the structure came from enslaved and marginalized workers whose contributions were deliberately minimized or erased from public memory. Their work laid the founda, for a symbol of freedom that did not extend to them. This contradiction was not accidental. It reflected a system that prioritized the appearance of democratic ideals while relying on inequality to sustain them. From its first bricks, the building carried the weight of this moral debt. Financially, the structure demanded far more than initial projections suggested. Early estimates failed to account for repeated redesigns, security concerns, and political pressure to create something impressive enough to command respect. Public funds were diverted, redirected, and justified under the banner of national necessity. The cost was framed as an investment in stability, but it established a pattern where the preservation of power justified continuous expenditure with limited scrutiny. As the years passed, the price did not diminish. Maintenance, renovations, expansions, and security upgrades became permanent expenses. Each generation added layers of infrastructure to respond to new threats, new technologies, and new political realities. What began as a residence slowly transformed into a fortified complex. The public saw only the facade, while beneath it grew an increasingly expensive system designed to protect not just people but authority itself. The symbolic value of the building amplified its cost, because it came to represent the nation. Any threat to it was treated as a threat to the country as a whole. This allowed extraordinary measures to be taken in its defense. Entire neighborhoods were reshaped, access was restricted, and public space was reduced in the name of protection. The financial burden of these measures was absorbed quietly, normalized as the unavoidable. Untold Price of Leadership. Beyond money and labor, the cost extended into governance. Decisions made within its walls gained disproportionate influence simply because of their location. The building elevated individuals, turning personal authority into institutional power. Over time, this concentrated decision-making created distance between leaders and the public. The structure became both a literal and symbolic barrier, reinforcing the idea that power resided in a protected space, separate from ordinary life. The maintenance of the building's image required careful management of narrative. Its history was curated to emphasize continuity and legitimacy, while uncomfortable truths were softened or omitted. Public tours showcased grandeur, tradition, and symbolism, but rarely addressed the full context of how the structure came to exist or what it demanded to sustain. This selective storytelling was itself a cost, paid in transparency and historical honesty. The building also shaped how the nation responded to crisis. Because it was seen as the heart of authority, moments of instability often led to expanded executive power concentrated within it. Emergency measures introduced to protect the institution frequently outlived the crises that justified them. Each expansion of authority carried long-term consequences, altering the balance between security and liberty in subtle but lasting ways. Internationally, the structure functioned as a stage for power projection. Its image was broadcast around the world as a symbol of leadership and control. Maintaining this image required continuous investment in diplomacy, defense, and ceremony. The cost of appearing strong became inseparable from the cost of governing. Power learned that perception could be as influential as policy, and resources flowed accordingly. The public, meanwhile, bore much of the burden indirectly. Taxpayers funded expansions they would never fully see, security measures they would never access, and decisions made beyond their immediate reach. The building's authority grew even as public trust fluctuated. This imbalance created tension between the ideals the structure represented and the reality it produced. Over time, the building ceased to be merely a place where power operated. It became a mechanism through which power justified itself. Its existence, history, and symbolism were used to validate actions, silence criticism, and frame decisions as inevitable. Questioning the institution felt, to some, like questioning the nation itself. The true cost, then, was not limited to finances or labor. It was paid in distance, in the gradual normalization of secrecy, and in the elevation of image over accountability. The building absorbed these costs quietly, presenting stability on the surface while accumulating complexity beneath it. What the public saw as permanence was sustained by constant investment, adjustment, and compromise, revealing that the price of power was never a single payment, but an ongoing exchange that reshaped democracy itself. As the institution grew in influence, so did the invisible systems built around it. Power does not operate in isolation, and the structure gradually became the center of an expanding network of control, protection, and secrecy. What began as a residence and workplace evolved into a heavily managed environment where access, information, and movement were tightly regulated. This transformation carried a cost that went far beyond budgets and blueprints. Security became one of the most expensive and defining elements. Each new era brought new threats, real or perceived, and each threat justified additional layers of protection. Fences rose, checkpoints multiplied, airspace restrictions expanded, and surveillance systems became permanent features. These measures were rarely temporary. Once introduced, they became part of the normal landscape. The public adjusted, often without debate, accepting reduced access as the necessary price of safety. Over time, this normalization reshaped how citizens related to their own symbols of governance. The expansion of security also altered the surrounding city. Streets were closed, routes redirected, and neighborhoods transformed to accommodate protective needs. Local life adapted around the demands of power. Businesses adjusted, residents complied, and public space quietly gave way to controlled zones. The cost was shared unevenly, absorbed into daily life rather than openly accounted for. What was lost was not only convenience but a sense of shared ownership over civic space. Inside, secrecy became an operational norm. Decisions increasingly took place behind closed doors, justified by the need for confidentiality and national interest. While some secrecy was necessary, its expansion shifted the balance between transparency and authority. Information became a resource managed carefully, released selectively, and framed strategically. This control over narrative shaped public perception as much as policy itself. The building's role in crisis amplified this dynamic. During wars, economic collapses, and national emergencies, authority concentrated within its walls. Temporary powers were assumed, often with broad public support driven by fear or urgency. Yet history shows that such powers are rarely fully relinquished. Each crisis left behind precedents, expanding the scope of executive influence and redefining the limits of acceptable control. This accumulation of authority carried long-term consequences. As decision-making became more centralized, the distance between leadership and everyday experience grew. Policies affecting millions were shaped within a protected environment far removed from their immediate impact. This separation was not just physical but psychological. Power became insulated, operating within a bubble reinforced by security, protocol, and hierarchy. The cost was also cultural. The institution shaped how leadership was perceived and performed. Ceremony, tradition, and symbolism became tools for reinforcing legitimacy. Public appearances were carefully staged, language was measured, and imagery was curated. While these rituals created a sense of continuity, they also blurred the line between representation and reality. The image of control sometimes mattered more than the substance behind it. Economically, the continuous operation of this system required vast resources. Security personnel, technology, maintenance, intelligence coordination, and logistical support formed an ecosystem sustained year after year. These costs were rarely debated individually. They were bundled into larger budgets, framed as essential and unavoidable. The cumulative effect, however, represented a significant and ongoing investment in maintaining authority rather than directly addressing public needs. The presence of such concentrated power also influenced political behavior. Proximity to the institution became a form of influence in itself. Advisors, officials, and interest groups competed for access, knowing that physical closeness often translated into political leverage. This dynamic shaped careers, priorities, and decisions, reinforcing hierarchies within governance. Power attracted power, creating a self-reinforcing system. Over time, this environment shaped expectations of leadership. Strength became associated with control, decisiveness with authority, and security with restriction. Citizens were encouraged to equate safety with surveillance and stability with limitation. These associations did not arise overnight. They developed gradually, reinforced by repeated narratives during moments of uncertainty. The cost of this evolution was subtle but profound. Democratic ideals emphasize participation, openness, and accountability. Yet the mechanisms designed to protect power often worked in tension with these values. As layers of control thickened, opportunities for public engagement narrowed. Trust was expected rather than earned, justified by the gravity of responsibility held within the institution. Internationally, this model influenced how other governments understood power. The image projected outward suggested that authority required fortification, secrecy, and centralized command. This perception shaped global norms, encouraging similar structures elsewhere. The cost, therefore, extended beyond national borders, influencing how power was exercised and justified worldwide. What emerged was a paradox. An institution meant to symbolize democratic governance gradually adopted characteristics associated with insulation and control. This was not the result of a single decision, but of countless incremental choices made in response to fear, ambition, and uncertainty. Each choice seemed reasonable in isolation, yet together they reshaped the nature of authority. The ongoing price was paid not only in money or space, but in expectations. Citizens learned to accept distance as normal, restriction as protection, and opacity as necessity. Power learned that it could expand quietly, justified by its own importance. The cost of this arrangement was rarely presented as a choice, but experienced as a gradual shift in how governance was lived and understood as the institution endured across generations. Its influence extended beyond policy and security into the deeper fabric of national identity. What it represented began to shape how people understood authority, citizenship, and belonging. Over time, the building became more than a seat of governance. It became a psychological anchor, a symbol through which ideas of power were taught, absorbed, and normalized. This symbolic weight carried its own cost, one measured not in budgets, but in perception. From an early age, citizens were introduced to the institution as a centerpiece of national life. Images of it appeared in textbooks, broadcasts, ceremonies, and moments of crisis. It was framed as stable, enduring, and central to the nation's story. This repetition created familiarity, and familiarity bred acceptance. Authority came to feel permanent and inevitable, rather than conditional and accountable. Power was no longer something temporarily granted by the public, but something that seemed to exist on its own terms. This perception subtly altered the relationship between people and governance. When authority feels permanent, questioning it feels disruptive rather than civic. Criticism becomes framed as threat instead of participation. Over time, this mindset reduces public engagement not through force, but through resignation. The cost here is civic confidence. Citizens begin to doubt their role as active participants, and instead adopt the posture of observers. The symbolism of the institution also shaped how leadership was judged. Success became tied to performance within its walls, rather than outcomes beyond them. Public attention focused on speeches, appearances, and rituals, while long-term consequences unfolded more quietly. Leadership became theatrical. Optics mattered as much as substance, sometimes more. This emphasis diverted attention away from structural issues toward moments designed for reassurance or spectacle. Media played a significant role in reinforcing this dynamic. Coverage often centered on the building itself, treating it as the stage upon which history occurred. This framing elevated the institution above the people it was meant to serve. Decisions were narrated through its perspective, conflicts defined by proximity to it, and legitimacy measured by access to it. Over time, the story of governance became the story of the institution, narrowing the lens through which national life was understood. The cost of this narrative concentration was a gradual erosion of pluralism. Other centers of civic life, such as local communities, grassroots movements, and regional institutions, faded from prominence. Power appeared centralized not only in practice, but in imagination. Solutions were expected to come from one place, reinforcing dependence rather than distributed responsibility. Internationally, the symbolic dominance projected an image of centralized authority as the ideal model. The building became shorthand for national will, even when internal divisions were deep. This simplification masked complexity and encouraged the belief that unity could be manufactured through presentation, rather than negotiated through participation. The cost was a distorted understanding of democracy itself. Over time, the institution's endurance also shaped expectations around change. Structural reform began to feel slow, distant, and unlikely. When power appears immovable, reform feels cosmetic. This perception discourages sustained engagement, replacing it with cycles of hope and disappointment. Citizens invest emotionally in moments, elections, or figures, rather than in long-term civic processes. The result is fatigue, not because change is impossible, but because it feels unreachable. There was also a generational cost. Each generation inherited not only the institution, but the assumptions surrounding it. Questioning its scope or influence required effort against deeply embedded narratives. The building's continuity created the illusion that its current form was inevitable, rather than the product of historical choices. This obscured the fact that systems can be redesigned, recalibrated, and redistributed. The symbolic power also influenced how crises were remembered. Events became defined by what happened within or around the instituti, even when their causes and consequences were widespread. This narrowed historical understanding, compressing complex social dynamics into a single focal point. Over time, this habit shaped collective memory, reinforcing the centrality of authority while marginalizing broader experiences. The most enduring cost, however, was subtle. It was the quiet shift in how people understood their own agency. When power feels distant, protected, and permanent, participation feels optional rather than essential. Citizenship becomes passive. Democracy becomes something observed rather than practiced. This transformation did not occur through force or decree, but through repetition, symbolism, and habit. What emerged was a system where power was not only exercised, but believed in. The institution did not merely govern, it shaped belief about governance itself. That belief carried weight, influencing behavior, expectations, and tolerance for limitation. The cost of this belief was not immediately visible, but it accumulated over time, shaping a civic culture more accepting of distance, less demanding of accountability, and increasingly accustomed to authority existing beyond reach. The story of what the White House cost America is not confined to budgets, construction, or security expenditures. Its true price is measured in how power evolved, how authority became centralized, and how distance quietly grew between governance and the governed. What began as a practical seat of leadership transformed into a permanent symbol that reshaped expectations, behavior, and civic identity. Over time, the building came to represent stability, but also inevitability, encouraging trust in structure rather than participation in process. This transformation carried hidden costs. As power concentrated, accountability became harder to perceive. Decisions felt distant, reform felt slow, and citizenship gradually shifted from active engagement to passive observation. The institution did not diminish democracy by force, but by familiarity, by becoming so constant that it faded into the background of everyday life, unquestioned and assumed. Authority became less visible in action, yet more powerful in perception. The legacy of this cost is not found in stone or security walls, but in the habits of a nation. When power appears permanent, challenge feels disruptive. When leadership feels theatrical, substance becomes harder to measure. When symbols dominate, systems escape scrutiny. Understanding this history is not about dismantling institutions, but about remembering that they were built by choice, shaped by circumstance, and sustained by belief. The untold price of power is not what it demands in money, but what it quietly takes in attention, agency, and responsibility. And the moment a society forgets that power exists to serve, rather than endure, is the moment its greatest cost is finally paid.